Seattle General in Norfolk smells like bleach and fear. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that makes even the healthy look half dead. The linoleum squeaks under soft-soled shoes, a sound that echoes down corridors where time moves differently than in the outside world. Here, a minute can be a lifetime. A second can be the difference between breathing and flatline. Danielle Ross moves through the ICU like smoke, present but unobtrusive, charting vitals with the precision of someone who understands that every number tells a story. She repositions Mr. Chen in Bay 7 with hands that know exactly how much pressure to apply, enough to prevent bedsores, not enough to disturb the arterial line running into his wrist. Her scrubs hang loose, navy blue, the kind that disappear in fluorescent light. The road map of scars across her shoulders, thin white lines that catch the light only if you know where to look, remains hidden beneath the fabric. She wears her hair in a braid pulled so tight it could be used as a rope. She speaks in whispers. She avoids eye contact. She is, to every surface observer, exactly what she appears to be, a quiet nurse who will never demand attention, never claim recognition, never threaten the institutional hierarchy that keeps doctors at the top and nurses perpetually grateful for their place. No one knows that her quietness is a choice. Discipline, not temperament. Dr. Mercer arrives for morning rounds at 7:43 a.m., moving through the ICU with the posture of a man who believes his presence should cause a visible shift in atmospheric pressure. He is tall, 6'2", maybe 3, and he carries himself like a shark, all predatory grace and unearned confidence. His white coat costs more than most nurses' monthly rent. His stethoscope is made of actual mahogany and German silver, not plastic. His watch is a Rolex Submariner that catches the fluorescent light like a tiny advertisement for his own importance. He glances at Danielle as he passes Bay 8, watches her work and fall line into the papery skin of Mrs. Patterson with a steady hand and a murmured reassurance, "Just a moment, sweetheart. You're doing great." Mrs. Patterson, who has been terrified of needles for 63 years, stops trembling. Mercer's jaw tightens. He watches as Danielle finishes the line, 18-gauge angiocath, threaded smooth as silk on the first attempt, secures the tape with the kind of anatomical precision that suggests muscle memory, and moves to the next patient without seeking his approval or acknowledgement. She doesn't look at him. She doesn't perform her competence for an audience. The work simply exists, complete and efficient, as if she were alone in the room. This bothers him more than he can articulate. By 8:15 a.m., when the administrator wheels past with a new patient file, Mercer is still thinking about the way Danielle's fingers moved, the way she communicated through touch instead of words, the way patients visibly relaxed under her hands. He is thinking about something he has spent 23 years trying not to think about. That competence cannot be bought. That authority cannot be granted through a prestigious letterhead or a title stitched into your white coat. That respect is earned through 1,000 small actions that most people never notice. The administrator stops at his shoulder. Room 304. New admission. Army Ranger, critical pulmonary status. Shrapnel through the lower left lung from a blast in Ramadi 4 weeks ago. Stabilized but fragile. Needs eyes on him constantly. Mercer nods. His fingers tighten on his clipboard. Danielle will be his primary care, the administrator continues, already moving away. She requested the assignment. Mercer's head snaps up. She requested it. Said she had experience with combat trauma. Military background, apparently. Quiet about it, but her credentials check out. The administrator disappears into an elevator, leaving Mercer standing in the hallway with a clipboard he no longer remembers holding. A nurse with military background. A nurse who requested a critical patient. A nurse who doesn't need his permission, his validation, his presence in order to move through this hospital like she owns it. By 8:44 a.m., the Ranger is in room 304. His name is Marcus Webb, 24 years old, medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment 2nd Battalion, combat medic badge stitched onto his Class A uniform that hangs in the closet beside his bed. The uniform will never fit him the same way again. His left lung is wrapped in bandages that will stay in place for weeks, maybe months. His oxygen saturation hovers at 92%, acceptable, but fragile. His eyes are closed, and the ventilator beside his bed hisses like a mechanical dragon, keeping him alive one breath at a time. Danielle enters room 304 at 8:52 a.m. She has changed into fresh scrubs. Her badge has been clipped to her hip at exactly the right angle. In her jacket pocket, the one hanging in her locker 3 floors below, the faded unit patch is positioned exactly as it has been positioned for 18 months, tucked inside the lining, sewn with military stitches that will never come undone, pressed against her heart like a prayer or a secret or both. She stands at the foot of Webb's bed for exactly 8 seconds without moving. Her hands are perfectly still. Her breathing is perfectly even. Someone watching might think she is simply reviewing his chart, but her eyes are not moving across the lines of text. They are fixed on the uniform hanging in the closet, on the name tape, on the unit patch velcroed to the chest. 75th Ranger Regiment. Her lips do not move. Her jaw does not tighten. The trembling that someone else might feel, someone without 18 years of combat training, does not occur. She simply blinks once, hard, and returns to the present moment as if it has been no more than a second. She adjusts his ventilator settings with the confidence of someone who has done this before, in places where the air smells like diesel exhaust and blood and dust instead of bleach. She checks his arterial line, his catheter, his cardiac monitor. She repositions him with hands that remember how to handle fragile human bodies with the care they deserve. She reads the room like she is reading a tactical map, understanding the geometry of survival, the angle of oxygen flow, the pressure points where a life can tip in either direction. When she finishes, she makes a note in his chart, patient stable. Pulmonary function holding at acceptable parameters. Alert to command when sedation lightened. No complications noted. Will monitor Q2H through end of shift. She does not write, I served with your unit. I was in Ramadi when you were taking shrapnel. I understand exactly what you will face when you wake up. I will keep you alive not because it is my job but because it is my duty and because the life in front of you matters more than the rest of my career combined. She simply leaves the room and moves to the next patient, as quiet as she arrived. Dr. Mercer is waiting at the nurse's station when she returns. He is standing with his shoulders squared, his expensive watch positioned on his wrist so the light catches it exactly right. His eyes are moving across her chart, the one she has already filled out, already documented, already completed with a precision that leaves him nothing to criticize and nowhere to stand. The Ranger in 304, he says without preamble. I'll be overseeing his care personally. Military cases require a certain standard of expertise. Danielle glances up from the medication dispenser where she is pulling antibiotics for the next round. She meets his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to acknowledge him, not long enough to be confrontational. Yes, doctor, she says quietly. And I'll need you to flag any changes immediately. He's a critical patient, and I don't want his care compromised by someone working outside their scope. Her hands continue moving. Precision. Discipline. She does not flinch. She does not defend herself. She simply nods and returns to her work as if his words have landed with no more impact than wind against a wall. Mercer steps closer, his voice dropping. I spent 10 years training to handle cases like this. I have degrees from Johns Hopkins. I have published research on trauma recovery. Let's make sure we're clear about who's managing this patient. Danielle finishes pulling the antibiotic vials and sets them in the medication drawer with the same care she would use positioning a patient's head to protect a cervical spine. When she turns back, her voice is soft, measured, impossibly calm. I understand, doctor. I'm just a nurse. The words are perfectly calculated. They contain exactly the right amount of deference. They provide exactly the response a man like Dr. Mercer requires to feel in control. They are also, from the perspective of someone who has held a perimeter under fire for 18 hours while rounds came in from 3 directions, perfectly, entirely false. Mercer smiles. He cannot help himself. The smile contains satisfaction, vindication, the sweet taste of hierarchy reinforced. "Good," he says. "See that you remember it." He walks away, and Danielle stands motionless at the medication station for 3 seconds. No one watching would see anything amiss. No one would notice the way her fingers have tightened on the edge of the counter, the way the muscles in her jaw have tensed and released, the way she is consciously, deliberately, methodically controlling the cascade of responses her body wants to make. She breathes in through her nose. She breathes out through her mouth. She counts to 4 on the inhale and 5 on the exhale, a technique she learned in combat training, a way to signal the nervous system that the threat has passed, that you are safe, that you can continue the mission. The mission. That is what this is. Not a nursing job. Not a career. A mission with parameters and objectives and a timeline that only she understands. She is here to monitor the flow of wounded Rangers through Seattle General. She is here to ensure their care meets the standard they deserve. She is here because her unit put her here, and the unit comes before everything, before ambition, before recognition, before the satisfaction of telling a man like Dr. Mercer exactly what she thinks of him. By 10:15 a.m., room 304's monitor shows a steady heart rate of 88, blood pressure holding at 118/74, oxygen saturation at 94%. The Ranger is stable. The mission is on track. Danielle moves through the rest of her shift like a ghost, quiet and present and utterly invisible to anyone watching for drama. She takes vitals. She documents changes. She anticipates needs before patients voice them. She moves with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who has spent half her life in places where hesitation costs lives. And in her locker, buried inside her jacket lining where no one will ever look, the faded unit patch waits like a promise or a threat, depending on your perspective. Room 310 smells like antiseptic and fear. An elderly patient lies propped against pillows, his daughter hovering at the bedside with the intensity of someone watching for thieves. 2 grandchildren sit in vinyl chairs, swinging their legs. Danielle enters with the anticoagulant ordered for 1,400 hours, but the patient's nausea peaked at 11:30, and his breakfast came back. She checks the clock, 13:47. She approaches the daughter first, a courtesy, a read of the room, and explains in the measured voice of someone used to being heard, his gastric system needs another 30 minutes. Anticoagulant on an empty stomach risks aspiration. The evidence supports waiting. The daughter nods. Relief crosses her face. This is what trust looks like. Dr. Mercer enters like a knife finding its sheath. "Ms. Ross, walk me through your rationale for delaying the anticoagulant." Not a question. A challenge, performed. His voice carries the weight of someone accustomed to rooms bending around him, tall enough that his presence changed the air pressure, the way a predator changes the temperature of a room simply by entering it. She explains again. Nausea. Aspiration risk. Evidence-based protocol deviation justified by clinical judgment. That's not protocol. He cuts her off like she's interrupted him. Are you suggesting you know better than the pharmacist? Than me? He turns to the daughter. Establishes dominion. I ordered the medication for a reason. The daughter's face shifts. Doubt creeps in like cold water. Is she qualified to be here? Mercer shrugs. The gesture is small. Devastation wrapped in a shoulder. She's certified. Qualified is a different question. He doesn't smile. Smiling would be unprofessional. Cruelty in a white coat requires that thin veneer of clinical concern. Danielle takes one measured breath. Her hands remain steady, hands that have held arterial pressure while helicopters landed, that have packed wounds under mortar fire, that know the difference between pain and data. A single tear escapes from her left eye. Not trembling. Not breaking. Just appears, like evidence, like a fact she didn't consent to but cannot deny. She wipes it away without breaking eye contact with Mercer and says, "I follow evidence-based practice, doctor." The words are quiet. They are also a wall. He dismisses her with a hand wave, the gesture of someone removing trash. The family watches her leave like contagion might be airborne. The grandchildren stop swinging their legs. Even they understand, something shifted. The nurse became vulnerable. The nurse became wrong. She administers the medication at 14:20. The patient tolerates it. No aspiration. Stable vitals. The evidence vindicates the clinical judgment. But Mercer has already left room 310, and truth travels slower than narrative. The break room, 3 days later. Fluorescent lights hum their electronic prayer. A cold sandwich sits in Danielle's Tupperware, turkey, dry mustard, wheat bread, bought from the hospital cafeteria during a 12-hour shift where she'd eaten nothing until hour 9. For nurses occupy a corner table, laughing about something inconsequential, the kind of laughter that comes from shared exhaustion and the need to believe the work matters. Danielle sits at the edge table. Opens her container. Takes a bite. Dr. Mercer enters. Pours coffee from the communal pot. The room watches him the way prey watches apex predators, with the absolute attention of creatures aware they might become consumed. He speaks loud enough for everyone, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who has never experienced consequences. I heard pharmacy flagged another Ross special. Apparently she thinks clinical guidelines are suggestions. One nurse stands. Gathers her things. The other 3 follow, a synchronized evacuation, like schools of fish sensing the presence of sharks. Within 90 seconds, Danielle sits alone. The sandwich tastes like cardboard now. She eats 3 bites. Throws the rest away. Returns to the floor without showering the incident off, because that's the point, the incident doesn't wash off. It clings. Her hands still don't shake. But that wasn't the worst part. The public write-up appears on the unit board during night shift, printed on official hospital letterhead, posted where every staff member will see it during morning huddle. Incident report. Danielle Ross. Insubordination Re, Protocol 7.3.2. Dr. Mercer's signature in blue ink, the color of authority. No specifics. Just the accusation, framed like a fact. By morning rounds, 2 nurses won't make eye contact. The nursing supervisor has seen it. She will call Danielle into her office before shift, not a conversation, a notification. The report sits on her desk like a cobra at rest, harmless until it isn't. He's building a termination case, the supervisor says, and the words are kind but the message is clear: protect yourself. Document everything. Distance yourself. Because hospital politics operate like triage, save the ones you can, which means abandoning the ones you can't. Danielle nods once. At the nurse's station, Mercer corners her with the ranger's chart. Room 304. The patient whose name she knows, whose unit she served with, whose trauma she can read in the ventilator settings like a book written in body language and bone. Your documentation on the 304 patient is sloppy, Mercer says. Not a question. An accusation, performed for the 3 nurses charting nearby. Vague. Are you even reading his history? His finger taps the chart. Tap. 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 Like a judge's gavel on wood. She responds with the voice of someone trained to speak under fire. His vitals are stable. Dressings clean. Pain managed. Each sentence is a fact. Each fact is a shield. He's a war hero, Mercer continues, his voice dropping to the register that comes just before destruction. And you're treating him like a routine case. Maybe you don't understand what real sacrifice looks like. He leans close, invading the space where only intimacy belongs, and his breath carries coffee and something else, something like victory. Like the smell of a predator that has already decided to feed. Danielle's jaw tightens. One tear escapes. She wipes it. And says, I understand sacrifice, doctor. He smirks. Do you, Nightingale? The nickname spreads by end of shift like a virus looking for hosts. Danielle, the quiet one. Danielle, who cries. Danielle, the nightingale, the bird that sings beautifully, but sings alone and will never be heard over the roar of human voices demanding to be noticed. It's cruel because it's technically kind. It's beautiful. It just erases her. That same afternoon, she monitors the Ranger in 304 during her scheduled vitals rounds. His chest rises and falls with the mechanical precision of the ventilator, the machine breathing for him, keeping him alive by forcing air through lungs that took shrapnel meant for someone else. His service record sits on the chart. Unit designation confirmed. Army Ranger, attached to combat operations in Ramadi's Jolan district, casualty date marked in red. She reads his name like reading a name on a memorial. He was her replacement. She knows what her old position cost him. The machines beat their rhythm. Steady. Reliable. Better than human hearts, which break. Her phone buzzies. A text from a number she hasn't memorized, upload status. Encrypted. Routed through proxy servers. She photographs discrepancies in his chart with movements so small they could be normal nursing care, adjusting his checking his pupils, documenting findings. But what she's really documenting is the unusual number of system errors that corrupt his intake records. Someone is scrubbing his file. Someone is making his history disappear. She uploads the photographs to a server she accesses through a fake nursing education portal, and the data streams into classified systems where the people she actually works for can see what's happening. The Ranger remains unconscious. The beeping continues. And Danielle Ross, Captain, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to intelligence operations she can't discuss and assigned to civilian hospitals to monitor the movement of soldiers through the medical system, does her job with the precision of someone for whom perfect isn't a preference, it's a baseline requirement. Mercer stops by room 304 during evening rounds. Reviews the chart with the intensity of someone looking for weapons to use. His eyes scan the numbers like they're scripture he's translating for war. He turns to Danielle. I want daily written summaries of his condition. On my desk by 0700. Detailed. Every vital, every medication, every observation. I need to understand what's happening with this patient. It's not standard protocol. It's a trap. More documentation he can twist, weaponize, use to prove she's either dishonest or incompetent. Of course, doctor, she says, and the words are soft because that's her cover, soft, compliant, grateful for the opportunity to prove herself. She agrees without argument because arguments are what he wants. Arguments create witnesses. Arguments create proof that she's difficult, unstable, threatening to the authority structure. Better to be silent. Better to disappear into the work like she has 17 times before, in 17 different cities, in 17 different uniforms disguised as civilian lives. That night, she runs the Ranger's service number through restricted databases she shouldn't be able to access but can, databases that exist in the spaces between official and official, where the real work happens. The file confirms what she suspected, assignment to Charlie Platoon, 3rd Battalion, attached to Task Force Ranger operations in Fallujah's western sector, reassigned to Ramadi's Jolan district, combat loss documented. He was her replacement. He took shrapnel in the position she occupied until her cover required reassignment to civilian infrastructure monitoring. The mission suddenly has a face. Worse, it has a name. And lungs that still rise and fall, still fighting, still surviving the thing that should have killed him. She stands at the window of her apartment that night, the city lights spread below like fallen stars, and she allows herself to feel something that isn't useful, isn't tactical, isn't mission relevant. It passes quickly. The training sees to that. But for 30 seconds, she is neither a nurse nor a soldier. She is just someone who has lost things that can't be recovered, watching over someone who should have been her instead. The next morning, she returns to Seattle General and becomes the quiet nurse again, the one Mercer dismisses, the one the staff avoids, the one everyone believes they understand because she tells them nothing that might contradict their certainty. The unit patch remains hidden inside her jacket lining, sewn into the hem with the precision of someone for whom loose threads aren't allowed. Waiting. The Ranger in room 304 woke up fighting the ventilator tube. Not fighting like a man in distress, fighting like a soldier, remembering where he was, what had happened, why his chest felt like someone had packed it with broken glass and rage. His eyes snapped open at 0600 hours. Pupils reactive. Hands clenching the bed rails with the grip strength of someone who'd spent 18 months holding a rifle in Ramadi's killing heat. Danielle was there when it happened, checking his lines, and she felt the shift in the room like a change in air pressure before a storm, the sudden electricity of a man coming back to consciousness, synapses firing in sequence, muscle memory trying to move a body that wouldn't obey. He tried to pull the endotracheal tube. His hand came up involuntary, desperate, and she was there in 2 steps, not touching him yet, just present, voice low and steady like she was talking a sniper off a ledge. "You're safe. Seattle General. The tube's keeping you breathing. Try not to fight it." His eyes found hers and held. Recognition flickered, not of her face necessarily, but of something in her bearing, the way she stood with her weight distributed evenly, the way her hands were ready but not hovering. The way she moved like someone who understood what his body had been through because hers had survived worse. The monitors sang their mechanical song. Oxygen saturation 96%. Heart rate 118, strong, his young soldier's heart doing what hearts do when they wake from the edge of death. Respiratory rate climbing as he tried to override the ventilator's rhythm, as if his conscious will could outpace a machine programmed for his survival. She didn't stop him. She documented it. Spontaneous respiratory effort. Pain response intact. Pupillary response normal to light bilaterally. The words in the chart would matter soon enough, but right now what mattered was the Ranger understanding he was alive, that his lungs were working, that the war inside his chest was being fought by machines and medicine instead of his own deteriorating physiology. Dr. Mercer arrived at 0730 hours like weather moving in, the kind you could smell coming before you saw the clouds. He had the chart already in his hands, hadn't bothered to read it outside the room, was reviewing notes as he crossed the threshold. Danielle watched him scan the vital signs log, watched his jaw tighten slightly as he processed what the numbers told him. The Ranger was improving. Not dramatically, the pneumothorax was still there, still requiring monitoring, still a threat if the pressure built wrong, but improving in the ways that made hospital stays shorter and discharge dates real instead of theoretical. "Reduce the sedation by 20%, Mercer said. Not a question. Not a consultation. An order delivered to the room in general, as if the air itself was his audience. And I want the pain protocol adjusted. I'm reducing the morphine." Danielle's hand paused over the 4 line. Not trembling. Not hesitating. Just pausing, the way a chess player pauses before moving a piece when they've seen a trap 3 moves ahead. The Ranger's showing signs of respiratory distress during REM sleep. The higher sedation is helping him maintain. The chart doesn't indicate respiratory distress. Mercer didn't look at her. His eyes were on the monitor, on the steady green line of the heart rhythm, as if Danielle's words were background noise, hospital-grade static he'd learned to filter out years ago. What it indicates is a patient who's improving faster than expected, which means we can safely reduce the medication load and move toward extubation. Unless you have clinical evidence that contradicts the documentation you yourself have been entering. There it was. The trap disguised as logic. If she argued further, she was suggesting her current entries were wrong. If she backed down, she was surrendering the only leverage she had over Danielle's care, the ability to advocate for what his body actually needed versus what the clinical checklist demanded. She understood then what Mercer was doing. It wasn't just about humiliating her in front of an attending. It was about systematically removing her from meaningful participation in the Ranger's treatment, turning her into a task executor instead of a caregiver, someone who followed orders instead of someone who thought. She adjusted the sedation dial. The numbers dropped. 20% reduction in propofol flow. She documented it with the precision of someone committing an act she knew was wrong but couldn't prevent, her hand steady as she logged the change, as if steadiness was a form of prayer. And schedule a dressing change for 1,400 hours, Mercer continued, finally closing the chart and tucking it under his arm like a general carrying battle plans. I'll be supervising personally. I want to ensure our nightingale here doesn't improvise." The words landed with the specific weight of a man who'd learned that cruelty could be delivered flatly, without inflection, which somehow made it worse. Not angry. Just contemptuous. Like he was describing a known liability. Danielle began the prep at 1,230 hours, 2 hours before Mercer would arrive with his intentions and his hands. She moved through the routine like she'd invented it, sterile field arranged on the bedside table, fresh dressing packs opened and laid out in sequence, suction canister checked and ready, the crash cart rolled to the doorway with deliberate positioning, not so close that it would seem like emergency was expected, but close enough that it could be accessed in the time it took to cross a room. She'd learned this calculus in places where seconds determined whether people went home or went into body bags, and her hands executed it without consulting her conscious mind. The ranger's condition concerned her in ways the monitors wouldn't capture until it was too late. His oxygen saturation was holding steady at 96%, which looked fine, which registered as stable on all the screens and in all the digital readouts that Dr. Mercer trusted completely. But his respiratory pattern had changed. Shallower. More labored. Like his lungs were working harder to pull oxygen across tissue that had been scarred and compromised, that had taken shrapnel through its parenchyma and survived through trauma rather than repair. She flagged it verbally at 1,305 hours, catching Mercer as he entered the unit. The rangers showing asymmetric chest wall movement during inspiration. Residual pneumothorax in the chart. I recommend we have a chest tray available during the dressing change in case. I read the chart, Ms. Ross. Mercer's voice had the quality of dismissal perfected over decades, the kind of automatic refusal that didn't even require him to look at her. Do your job. Let me do mine. 11 words. That's all she got before he walked past, before his attention moved to the monitors and the wound assessment and the 17 other details competing for space in his clinical focus. She stood in the hallway for one breath, then another, then returned to checking the suction pressure, verifying the sterile field one final time, her hands moving through the choreography of preparation while her mind tracked the calculation she couldn't share: pneumothorax plus reduced sedation plus pain protocol reduction equals a patient whose body might not have the physiological buffer to handle stress. The dressing change began at 1,400 hours exactly. Mercer worked with competence, there was no denying that his hands were skilled, his technique was clean, his understanding of wound healing was textbook and practiced. He removed the old dressing with precision, exposing the chest wound that was healing with the kind of cellular cooperation that usually meant recovery. The drainage was minimal. The surrounding tissue wasn't red. Everything about it suggested the ranger's body was winning against infection, against sepsis, against the specific ways trauma broke people from inside. Danielle watched the monitors the way a sniper watches a rifle scope, absolute focus, every detail registering, nothing permitted to escape her attention. 98%. Then 94%. Then 89% in what felt like the space between heartbeats. She said nothing. Not yet. The drop could be normal, the ranger's repositioning affecting his oxygenation, a temporary thing that would correct as his lungs adjusted. But at 85%, Mercer ordered increased oxygen. Turn up the FiO2 to 60%, he told her, and she did it without comment, hand moving to the ventilator settings, watching the numbers adjust on the screen. The oxygen concentration climbed. 40%. 50%. 60%. The way oxygen should flood a failing system and reverse the decline. Except it didn't. 83%. 81%. The numbers descending like a timer counting down to something neither of them could stop. Danielle's eyes moved to the ranger's chest wall. Asymmetric. The right side moving with the ventilator. The left side barely moving at all. Not from pain. Not from sedation. From pressure. From air trapped in a space that couldn't expand anymore, from the pneumothorax that had been waiting in his records, documented in clinical language that had somehow failed to translate into clinical urgency. His neck veins were starting to distend. Thin lines becoming ropes. Danielle had seen this before in Ramadi when a ranger took a round through the ribs and pressure started building in the thoracic cavity like an invisible fist. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that killed people if you didn't relieve it in the next 2 minutes. Maybe 3 if you were lucky. Mercer's hand started shaking. Not much. Just a tremor that registered in the way his fingers lost their surgical precision, the way he set down the old dressing and stared at the monitor as if it was a problem he could think through, as if intellectual analysis could reverse physics. The ranger's lips were turning blue. Mercer reached for the call button. The oxygen saturation hit 78%. Danielle moved without thinking, without calculating, without considering what her next action would mean for her cover or her mission or her carefully constructed identity as just a nurse who followed orders. She crossed the room in 3 strides, her boots silent on the linoleum, and her voice changed. Not louder. Quieter. That was the thing Mercer didn't understand about command voice. It wasn't about volume. It was about absolute authority distilled into sound, the kind of voice that made soldiers move before their conscious minds caught up with the order, the kind of voice that had held a perimeter in Ramadi when everything was breaking apart. Step back, doctor. Now. The ranger's lung collapsed like a building imploding. One moment his oxygen saturation read 94%. The next, the monitor shrieked, a flat, accusatory wail that turned every head on the unit. Dr. Mercer stood frozen at the bedside, dressing change kit still in his hands, watching the numbers plummet. 87. 79. 72. His hands began to shake. Not from understanding what was happening, but from the terrifying certainty that he had no idea how to fix it. The ranger's chest wall had turned rigid. His face, the color of wet concrete, told the story. Tension pneumothorax. The residual collapsed lung from his Ramadi injury had finally let go, and now air was accumulating in the pleural space, crushing his heart like a fist closing. Every breath he took made it worse. Dr. Mercer stepped back. Someone needed to call the crash team. Someone needed to. Danielle was already moving. She didn't ask for permission. Didn't wait for orders. Muscle memory took over, and the quiet nurse dissolved like fog under sun. Her voice cut through the monitors, screaming with the precision of a command that had been issued across sandstorms and under mortar fire. 14-gauge needle. Now. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The foretech didn't question. He moved. The respiratory therapist repositioned the ranger's arm without being asked. They had worked with soldiers before. They recognized authority when they heard it. Danielle palpated the ranger's chest with hands that knew exactly what she was feeling for the distended intercostal space, the hyperresonance of trapped air, the anatomy of a man whose body was suffocating itself. 2 seconds. That's all she needed. She ripped open the crash cart, fingers moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this in the dark, under enemy fire, with nothing but a combat knife and while keeping a soldier alive. The 14-gauge angiocath needle caught the fluorescent light. She swabbed the site with one motion, found the space between the second and third ribs, and went in. The hiss was immediate. Air escaping, a sound like a tire deflating, like pressure releasing, like survival taking a breath. The monitor still screamed, but now it was a different scream. The ranger's oxygen saturation climbed, 78. 82. 87. His color returned to something human. His jaw unclenched. By the time the crash team burst through the doors 45 seconds later, he was stable. Breathing. Alive. The attending physician stared at Danielle, then at the needle secured in the ranger's chest, then at the monitor showing climbing oxygen levels. Her eyes moved to Dr. Mercer, who stood against the far wall, face gone the color of old bone. Who authorized that procedure? The attending asked quietly. Mercer's voice came out as a whisper. She didn't. I didn't. This is a massive violation of protocol. Policy 7.3.2 explicitly restricts invasive procedures to licensed physicians. The attending looked at the ranger. Looked at the monitor. looked at Danielle's hands, which were already removing her gloves with the same meticulous precision she'd used to save his life. The attending said nothing. Sometimes, in medicine, the body speaks louder than policy. But silence never lasts long in a hospital. Within 2 hours, Danielle was summoned to the supervisor's office on the 3rd floor. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone. The radiator clanked like distant artillery. Dr. Mercer had already filed his incident report. She could see it in the supervisor's face, in the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet Danielle's, in the manila folder on the desk that suddenly felt heavier than body armor. "You saved his life," Supervisor Chen said quietly, her hands folded on top of the file. "I've read the monitor strips. Your assessment was correct. The needle decompression was textbook, medically sound, expertly performed." Danielle waited. She had learned long ago that, but always came after the praise. "But you broke protocol. Policy 7.3.2 is clear. Invasive procedures are physician only. Dr. Mercer has documented 3 months of behavioral concerns, submitted a formal termination request with supporting evidence to administration, and copied the state nursing board and legal department." Chen's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who wanted to fight and had already lost. "The hospital's hands are tied. My hands are tied." She slid the termination letter across the desk. "Effective immediately." Danielle took it without reading. She already knew what it said. She had seen bureaucracy move like this before, fast and efficient and completely indifferent to the body count. She removed her hospital badge, the plastic still warm from her neck, and set it on the desk. The weight of 18 months lifted, replaced by something heavier, the knowledge that her cover was blown, her mission compromised, her assignment at Seattle General over. She walked to her locker in the break room, where the silence was thick as concrete. The staff she had worked beside for a year and a half didn't look up. They had learned her absence well. She pulled out her belongings, a spare pair of scrubs, a water bottle, the civilian jacket she'd worn when she arrived. She left the locker empty, clean, erased. The basement laundry room smelled of industrial bleach and the humid breath of industrial washers. Danielle folded her scrubs with the same precision she applied to everything, corner to corner, edges aligned, seams matched. One piece at a time. Surgical top, surgical pants, undershirt. Each crease sharp enough to cut. She stacked them in a perfect pile on the counter, her hand steady even as 18 months of classified intelligence work, careful infiltration, and methodical observation crumbled into nothing. The fabric was softer than body armor but heavier. She set the folded scrubs down and turned toward the elevator, her civilian jacket draped over her arm. The faded unit patch was visible through the torn lining, colors faded to ghosts by 17 years and 2 wars, a symbol of a life the hospital didn't know she carried. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor. She walked past room 30 for one final time. The ranger was sitting up, actually sitting, alert and breathing without assistance, the tube already removed from his chest. His eyes tracked her movement through the doorway. They caught on the jacket. On the patch visible through the torn seam. His voice was hoarse from the ventilator, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the hallway noise like a blade. "Reaper 6. Danielle stopped. Every muscle locked. That call sign belonged to a different life, a different war, a different version of herself. Only 2 people alive knew it, and one of them was supposed to still be in Ramadi. The Marine Hospital administrator escorting her out stopped cold, turned, and stared at the ranger in the bed. "What did you say, son?" the administrator asked. The ranger's eyes never left Danielle. "That's Reaper 6. Captain Ross. 75th Ranger Regiment. She's..." His voice broke. "She's Ranger." The administrator's face changed. Something shifted behind her eyes, a recognition, a recalibration, a sudden understanding that the quiet nurse being escorted out of Seattle General was something far more than a termination problem. She pulled out her tablet, accessed a file that absolutely did not exist in the normal personnel system, and began reading aloud, "Captain Danielle Ross, United States Army. 75th Ranger Regiment." Around them, the hallway froze. Nurses stopped mid-step. An orderly dropped a tray of instruments. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Dr. Mercer appeared at the end of the corridor, walking toward them with the confident stride of a man who'd just secured his victory. His hand clutched another complaint form. Another page in his fortress of paper and policy. The administrator continued, her voice steady and official. Remedy, Iraq. 18-hour sustained defense of forward operating position Kashmir under direct enemy fire. Combat medic attached to Ranger operations. She paused, glanced at Danielle, then continued reading, performed emergency field thoracotomy under fire using a combat knife and field supplies. Saved for soldiers. Lost 3. The silence was so complete you could hear the ventilators breathing. Mercer's mouth opened. I don't care what she claims to be, policy is. The elevator doors opened behind him. A 2-star general stepped out in dress uniform, ribbon stacked like a history of conflict, shoes polished to mirrors, presence that made the air pressure change. He surveyed the hallway with the calm assessment of someone who had commanded armies. His eyes found Danielle, then the administrator, then the file open on her tablet. The administrator read the next line, Silver Star for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in support of coalition forces. The general held his salute, the clean, sharp gesture of military respect, until Danielle, reflexively, returned it. The movement was automatic, sharp, nothing like the quiet nurse who had folded scrubs in the basement 20 minutes earlier. This was a soldier acknowledging a general's recognition. 3 nurses who had abandoned Danielle in the break room stepped back against the wall. A PA student pulled out her phone, then thought better of it. The ranger in room 304 tried to sit straighter, winced, tried anyway. The administrator's voice never wavered. Current assignment, Embedded Intelligence Operation, Seattle General Hospital. Authorized by Pentagon. Monitoring treatment protocols for wounded Rangers and investigating irregularities in military patient records. Mercer's face drained white. He looked at the general. At the administrator. At Danielle, who had already removed her gloves and folded them with the same meticulous precision she applied to everything, including the systematic dismantling of his career. I need some jello, Danielle said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. The ranger in 304 made a sound that might have been laughter, then pain, then something like hope. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Mercer. The worst part was just beginning. The stretcher wheel squeaked against tile as the hospital administrator escorted Danielle toward the staff exit, a cardboard box balanced in her arms containing 8 years of accumulated belongings, a coffee mug, a photograph, a single pair of surgical scissors with her initials engraved on the handle. Her scrubs were still damp from the crisis. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in institutional white, washing out her skin, making her look hollow. They passed room 304 without stopping, but the ranger's voice cut through the silence like a blade finding its mark. Reaper 6. It wasn't a question. It wasn't loud. Just those 2 words, whispered with the precision of someone trained to communicate across hostile terrain where volume meant death. Danielle's pace didn't falter. Her jaw didn't clench. But her eyes moved to the bed, and for a single moment, the mask slipped. The ranger was sitting up, his color better than it had been in 3 days, his breathing unlabored, his hand gripping the bedside rail with the grip of someone who'd survived. He was staring at her jacket, at the torn lining where the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch was visible, the edges frayed from years of being hidden, protected, kept close to her heart like a talisman against the lie she'd been living. The administrator stopped. Turned. His face registered confusion, then something else, recognition, the way a man's expression changes when he realizes he's been standing beside a legend and thought she was invisible. Wait, he said quietly. Wait 1 moment. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, classified stamps bleeding across the cover like arterial spray, and his hands trembled slightly as he opened it. When he read, his voice changed. It became reverent, the way men speak in churches or cemeteries. Captain Danielle Ross, he began, each word deliberate, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Ramadi, Iraq. You provided emergency medical intervention under sustained small arms fire. You extracted 3 casualties from a burning Humvee. You performed emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife when no surgical equipment was available. You remained engaged with hostile forces for 18 minutes while maintaining consciousness in a patient who would have bled out. He paused. The folder trembled in his hands. You were awarded the Silver Star. Behind them, Dr. Mercer appeared in the hallway, his suit pressed, his hair perfect, his complaint form clutched like a weapon. He'd been waiting, watching, timing this moment. His smile was thin as a razor. "I don't care what she claims to be," he said, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man who'd spent his entire career believing credentials were character, that titles were proof of worth. Policy is policy. She performed an unauthorized invasive procedure. She violated scope of practice. She endangered. The elevator doors opened. A 2-star general stepped out in dress blues, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, that made men instinctively stand straighter. His salute wasn't casual. It was formal, precise, the kind of salute you give to warriors who've earned it in blood and fire. He approached the administrator, who'd laid the Silver Star ribbon across the folder like an offering, and his eyes, ice blue, the color of a storming Atlantic, moved across the document. "That's my officer," the general said. Not a question. A statement of fact, the kind of fact that ends arguments before they begin. Mercer's face cycled through colors, red, white, mottled purple. "This is a hospital matter, General. Policy is subordinate to federal law," a voice cut in. An FBI agent materialized from the stairwell, badge and credentials already displayed like a surgeon's hands during scrub-in. His partner was already on a radio. "Dr. Mercer, 1 week ago, we detected unauthorized access to classified military personnel databases. Multiple attempts. Someone tried to verify and modify the service record of Captain Danielle Ross. Access logs show the login came from your office computer. After hours. Using your credentials." Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "I was just checking." "Checking federal property without clearance is a felony," the agent said, his voice like a tank idling in an underground garage. "Attempting to modify military service records is espionage adjacent." You triggered 3 separate alert systems, all of which routed directly to NCIS and DOD cybercrime. You've been under federal watch for 6 days. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator from 304 wheeze its mechanical rhythm, steady and perfect, the sound of a life Danielle had saved while this man watched with frozen hands. "The incident reports you filed," the agent continued, "are now evidence of workplace retaliation against an active federal operative. The termination request is interference with an ongoing investigation. Every memo, every complaint, every documented concern, it's all premeditation now. You built a paper fortress to crush her, Doctor. You just documented your own guilt." 2 more agents appeared with handcuffs. Not the theatrical kind from movies, the real ones, the kind that bite into wrists and carry the weight of consequences. Mercer's eyes went to Danielle, and for a moment he searched her face for mercy, for some sign that she would explain, that she would clarify, that she would reduce his humiliation the way a superior doctor reduces a subaltern's shame. She didn't blink. She didn't move. One hand rested on her torn jacket, exactly where the patch was visible. The other hung at her side, steady as a surgical laser. She'd seen worse things than this in Ramadi. She'd walked through worse things than professional destruction. And she'd learned something he would never understand: the loudest people in the room are usually the ones most afraid of silence. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent said, and the handcuffs clicked around Mercer's wrists like period punctuation on a sentence that was finally over. The perp walk through Seattle General took for minutes. Past the nurse's station where he'd built his reputation through condescension and cruelty. Past the break room where his whispers had poisoned people against her like a contamination spreading through a wound. Past the unit board where he'd posted her humiliation like a public execution announcement. Through the main entrance, where patients and families stood frozen, watching a doctor in federal custody guided into a black sedan with government plates, watching his career dissolve like sugar in rain. Danielle watched from a second-floor window, the general beside her, both of them silent. The ranger from room 304 was being helped into a wheelchair by a nurse, his movement slow but purposeful, and when he saw the handcuffs, when he understood what had happened, tears ran down his face, not from grief, but from the kind of catharsis that only comes when justice moves, when the universe finally corrects its imbalance. "Your mission?" the general asked quietly. Danielle's jaw tightened slightly. "Continues, sir. We need you here. Different cover. Same objective. The pharmaceutical diversion ring. You were right about the pattern. They were counting on someone too tired to notice." He turned to her. 6 more months. She breathed in, held it, released it. 6 more months. But that wasn't where the story ended. It wasn't even close to where the reckoning truly lived. 6 months later, Danielle walked past a community college in South Norfolk. The parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from delivery trucks, and through the window of the continuing education wing, she could see him. Dr. Mercer. Demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy to 15 bored students, his hair grayer now, his suit jacket hanging on a hook instead of his shoulders, a name tag that read CPR instructor, $15 hours clipped to his shirt pocket. The sign outside read, American Heart Association CPR certification, evening sessions, $49 per student. He was teaching life-saving skills to people who didn't care, collecting a minimum wage paycheck, his hands moving through compressions that lacked any precision, any authority, any of the confidence that had once filled every gesture. He glanced up. Saw her through the glass. His hands froze mid-compression on the plastic chest. She didn't stop. She kept walking. Behind her, the ranger from room 304 fell into step, the one who'd whispered her call sign, whose life she'd saved with a needle and muscle memory and 12 years of being prepared for impossible moments. He walked without a limp now, his recovery nearly complete, though the shrapnel scar would stay with him forever, a permanent reminder of what it meant to survive. Attached to his jacket, sewn exactly like hers, was a faded 75th Ranger Regiment unit patch. "Captain on deck," he said quietly. Danielle turned. He wasn't alone. 3 other Rangers, all former patients from her rotation at Seattle General, all men she'd treated while wearing scrubs and absorbing the contempt of a man who thought credentials meant character. The youngest one stepped forward and handed her a tablet. The screen glowed with classified file headers, Federal seal at the top. "The records you flagged led us to 8 arrests," he said. Pharmaceutical diversion ring. Staff members selling pain medication meant for wounded soldiers. They were falsifying military patient charts to cover the theft. Using the same system errors you documented in bathroom breaks between shifts. She reviewed the file. 12,470 hours of work. 8 years wearing a lie. Absorbing insults. Accepting humiliation. Staying invisible long enough to see the patterns, to photograph the evidence, to build the case that would take down a network of people profiting from the suffering of men like the one standing beside her. The mission didn't fail, another ranger said. It succeeded because you stayed silent when it mattered. Through the window of the continuing education room, Mercer was returning to his plastic dummy, mechanically pushing on its chest, the way a man pushes when he's already dead inside, when he's already accepted that the life he built on performance was just performance, that the authority he'd wielded was theater, that the competence he'd flaunted was a mask that finally slipped and revealed nothing underneath but fear. One of the Rangers asked the question that mattered, "What did you learn from Mercer, Captain?" Danielle considered it, watching the disgraced doctor fail to inspire a single student, fail to command a single moment, fail to matter to people whose lives he was supposed to save. That some people spend their whole lives collecting credentials because they're terrified someone will see their empty inside, she said quietly. That the loudest voices are usually compensating for the quietest souls. That power doesn't come from a title or a degree or a position on an organizational chart. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The Rangers fell into step beside her as she turned away from the window. 3 soldiers and their captain, walking through a parking lot that smelled like rain and possibility, invisible as always, which was exactly the way they preferred it. Behind them, in a community college classroom where the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song, Dr. Mercer taught chest compressions to people he would never inspire, living out his days in the quiet humiliation of anonymity, haunted by the memory of a nurse with ice in her veins who'd saved a life while he watched his career die, and who'd never once given him the satisfaction of seeing her break. If you made it this far, you understand something most people never learn: the quietest people in the room often carry the heaviest weight, the deepest scars, and the truest power. Subscribe for more stories about heroes who don't look like heroes, who operate in shadows, who change the world without anyone ever knowing their names. Like this video if you think Danielle deserved better from the start. And comment, what would you have learned if you walked in her shoes for a single day?